By the end of this chapter you should be able to define diffusion, define osmosis, describe the importance of the water potential gradient in the uptake of water by plants, define active transport, discuss the importance of active transport as an energy-consuming process. Diffusion. Diffusion is the movement of ions or molecules from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration. Concentration is amount of substance in a given volume. In diffusion, the particles move along the concentration gradient, that is, from where they are in higher concentration to where they are in lower concentration. Molecules required by various cells in the human body are absorbed through diffusion. Some cells have partially permeable membranes that allow some molecules to pass through. Diffusion requires no energy.
Hi everyone. Okay, in this lesson I'm going to tell you about diffusion and what it is. Basically, in simple terms, diffusion is where particles move from where there's lots of them to where there's not many of them until they're evenly dispersed. Okay, so I've got an example here. We've got a beaker, right? This beaker has some particles down in this bottom left-hand corner. And what we say is this is before equilibrium, right? What we need to understand is that particles are not staying still. They look like they are in this picture here, but particles are actually always in constant random motion, right? Now, these particles will eventually spread out. They'll move from this area where there's lots of them until they're evenly distributed. So, let's watch that take place. So we had the before equilibrium scenario. And now we've reached equilibrium. Okay, one thing to realise is that even though we've reached equilibrium here, that the particles still move. You just don't notice it because there's no net movement. These particles are still moving around, but they're staying evenly distributed. Okay, now what we want to see is how does this apply to the cell? So here we've got our cell. All right, now let's bring these particles back. Okay. Now with the cell, we say the membrane is semi-permeable. It's semi-permeable because it will allow some things to move across it and it won't allow other things to move across it. What determines whether something can move across the cell membrane is things like size and charge and whether it's lipid soluble. Remember, lipids are what make up the cell membrane. So if it's small enough to move across the membrane, if it doesn't have too much of a charge which stops it from moving across, and if it is soluble with lipids, it can move across. Now I've set this up so that we have a high concentration of particles outside of the cell and a low concentration of particles inside of the cell. We call this a concentration gradient. It's where there's a difference in the concentrations. Okay, now it is as simple as the scenario that we looked at in the beaker. Particles will move from where there are lots of them, a high concentration, to an area where there is less, a low concentration, until equilibrium is reached. So, remember, particles in constant motion, right? That movement will take place, and because it was a higher concentration outside of the cell, we end up with particles moving into the cell. It doesn't mean particles aren't moving out, because they are, but the net movement is particles moving into the cell until we reach an equilibrium. Now, that exact same scenario can happen reversed, where we can have particles moving from a high concentration inside of the cell to a low concentration outside of the cell by diffusion. Right, so it works both ways. It just depends on our concentration gradient, where the high concentration is, where the low concentration is, and that's where our movement will occur. Just to give you a bit of context, these particles here could be something like oxygen molecules or carbon dioxide molecules moving in and out of red blood cells. That occurs by diffusion. Okay, so that pretty much sums up our topic. I'll just give you this definition here. Alright, so this is what we've learned in this video. Diffusion is the movement of substances from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. One more thing for us to know. Diffusion is what we call passive. Put simply, that means it does not require energy. There are some other processes where molecules move in and out of the cell that do require energy. We call them active, but diffusion is not one of them. Okay, so that's diffusion. Hope this helps, and thanks very much for watching.
Osmosis. Osmosis is the passage of water molecules from a region of higher water potential to a region of lower water potential, through a partially permeable membrane. Where there are more water molecules, the concentration of the solution is low, and this is also called high water potential. Water potential is low when there are less water molecules. The concentration of the solution is high. In the diagram shown, water will diffuse from the dilute solution to the concentrated solution through the partially permeable membrane. As a result, the liquid level will rise on the left and fall on the right. The cytoplasm of the plant cell and the cell sap in its vacuole contain salts, sugars and proteins which effectively reduce the concentration of free water molecules inside the cell. The cell wall is freely permeable to water and dissolved substances, but the cell membrane of the cytoplasm is partially permeable. If a plant cell is surrounded by water or a solution more dilute than its contents, water will pass into the vacuole by osmosis. The vacuole will expand and press outwards on the cytoplasm and cell wall. When plant cells have absorbed a maximum amount of water by osmosis, they become very rigid, due to the pressure of water pressing outwards on the cell wall. The end result is that the stems and leaves are supported. If the cells lose water, there is no longer any water pressure pressing outwards against the cell walls, and the stems and leaves are no longer supported. At this point, the plant becomes limp and wilts. Active transport. Active transport is the movement of ions into or out of a cell through the cell membrane, from a region of their lower concentration to a region of their higher concentration against a concentration gradient, using energy released during respiration. It only occurs in living things because living things respire to obtain energy that is used to transfer ions against the concentration gradient. In active transport, some mineral salts that are required by plants from the soil are absorbed using active transport by root hair cells, as they are found in very small concentration in the soil, and thus are required to be taken up against the concentration gradient. Small intestine cells use active transport alongside diffusion to maximize the absorption of glucose and other substances. The table shows a comparison between the three processes.